Welcome to the Vanguard podcast, guys. This is Gavin, and
I'm Zach.
we've just been joined by Gloria La Riva. You're the candidate for president, running as the Party of Socialism and Liberation candidate. Gloria, you're in Portland right now. Do you want to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us what's going on in Portland right now?
Sure. This is a Tuesday today, and I came here on Saturday in order to take part in the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation's call that was national to demand an end to the threat of evictions and the police terror. They're both really working together because when people get evicted, it's police terror. And so I came to the rally that our young members here in PSL had organized, which was really great. And then in the evening, we went to the Saturday night protests. As you know, it's been more than 60 days of constant demonstration that's intensified with the arrival of these feds who first started, dragging people off the street, unidentified, unannounced, a real terror. And it was a great thing. I really wanted to come up to Portland. I wanted to be part of the protest and also to see what it is for myself, for not only the campaign, but I've participated in many, many anti-police brutality demonstrations over the years. And so I was up there in front with our members where there's a metal fence that surrounds the two federal buildings. One is the so-called Justice Center, the Injustice Center, and the other is another federal building that has been the main site of protest. And you could see that there was a wall of moms, the women dressed in yellow who are mothers, and they're all suited up ready for the tear gas and the little metal balls that hit people. And then behind them this time was the veterans, U.S. Army veterans, and also some of the men with lawn blowers. I was curious about the lawn blowers. Well, they blow back the tear gas and the spray that's sprayed on people. But it's very, very creative. It's great to see the community. And all these people put these black plywood shields against the fence, and they have to really push hard. What it's for is to protect people from these blasts from their weapon of these hundreds of little metal balls. I mean, imagine how damaging that can be. Yeah. They sting, they break open, and they have more than just the blow of the hit. They've got something chemical with them. And then the tear gas. There was no violence. People were just standing there and shouting, "Feds out of Portland." But then at about 11:30 comes the massive tear gassing. And God, it's awful. It's not my first time, but it's never easy.
Yeah, it's almost incredible that something that would be banned from war is used routinely against citizen protesters exercising their First Amendment right. I just wondered if, as a presidential candidate, is that something that you would stand for?
Oh, of course not. In my party and our newspaper and in our website and our campaign, we're saying that none of these weapons should be used against demonstrators. Not tear gas, not rubber bullets, not, clubs. Everything they use, there's no reason for it. People really are protesting, and they have a reason to protest these feds coming in. This new increased form of repression, and against the police brutality as well. But also, we don't want those weapons of war used abroad.
Yeah, I was about to say, it seems like the streets of America are finally getting a taste of the occupation that, goes on around the rest of the world in a lot of developing countries. And that's a good segue into a little bit of foreign policy. I know you've been outspoken about American imperialism and places like Venezuela, where there's an active coup trying to be taking place right now. Can you speak a little bit more about the PSL foreign policy in relation to the two-party imperialist foreign policy that's the norm in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning Venezuela. Just the day before yesterday, when President Maduro was on television going over the statistics and update on the COVID situation in Venezuela, he announced that there was new attempts on his life. The U.S., even though their puppet that they propped up last January, over a year ago, has completely failed in this puppet regime kind of attempt. Juan Guaido, even though he's completely discredited, he can't draw 10 people to a protest, literally, in Venezuela. The US hasn't stopped using him because it's the only thing that they have as a pretext for attacking this government, which is protecting the people against the US attempt to take over their oil, the largest source of oil in the world. Oil is still strategic to the US, but it's more than just the resources. It's also the example that Venezuela is providing to Latin America, as well as Cuba, which is under attack. And Trump has intensified the attack against both countries, even to the point of forcing all the ships that normally were delivering oil from Venezuela to Cuba, and in exchange for the doctors that operate in Venezuela, 23,000, providing free healthcare for that country. It's mutual exchange. It's a fair exchange of solidarity and support that the US is stepping in what really is an act of war, to blockade ships going to another country and preventing trade between two countries. That's war. But this is what the blockade and sanctions are about, and which most Americans don't even know about.
Yeah.
All the people here in the US is the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro, how people are starving, how they're crawling through the streets, there's no medicine. What they don't mention is that the US has blocked every medical shipment into the country, medicine that's been paid for by the government, and that the food deliveries, the US just has forced the arrest of a Colombian man who was helping arrange economic trade agreements so that food would be delivered into Venezuela, subsidized food for the population from Colombia and other areas. He's now under the arrest of the US by seeking extradition to the United States to be put on trial. And the US has thrown this jacket on the whole country, and the leadership saying that there's narco-terrorism going on. It's completely false. Venezuela has been a leader in fighting the drug trafficking. And in fact, it's Brazil and Colombia that are the known entities of major narco trafficking, supported by those governments. But they turn the victim into the
Yeah, and just to clarify, the Democrats provide absolutely no resistance to the puppet government that is supposedly being put up by the United States and represented by Juan Guaido. People remember at the State of the Union address, Nancy Pelosi, while she tore up Trump's speech, she was happy to clap along when they paraded Juan Guaido across. And it's a kind of this is happening all the time. If you look at the events that have recently occurred in Bolivia, where Evo Morales was ousted from power so that the United States could come in and pillage their lithium supplies, this is something that we're constantly seeing throughout Central and South America.
Yes, they fear the economic independence of these countries and that they won't have control of every source of wealth in the world. And also they're really fearful of the example of countries that are taking control of the resources, instituting new constitutions written by the people, a progressive turn to the left, and led by socialist presidents. Now, Venezuela is very unique because it is called the Bolivarian Revolution, named after Simon Bolivar, that started with Hugo Chavez, but it is inside of a capitalist country still. Much of the levers of the economy is controlled by the capitalists, but the oil is state-controlled, and the government is socialist, and the military has been greatly transformed, in addition to the control of the Supreme Court and the new National Constituent Assembly that has become sort of the quasi-assembly parliament, because the right-wing parliament was trying to dismantle many of the progressive laws that had been passed before. So there's a contention going on there, but the battle is about whether the people can run their own country and take destiny into their own hands. Like you said, Bolivia was a coup, and we see the effects. The indigenous people under attack. It is an indigenous nation.
We undermined their democracy. The indigenous people cast their vote overwhelmingly for Evo Morales. Their justice system allowed him to run for a fourth term. And yet all that you could read in the United States, even in a so-called liberal paper like the New York Times, was that, you know, Evo Morales represented some threat to democracy in Bolivia.
Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned the Times, because the New York Times, the liberal paper of the establishment.
Yeah, the liberal paper, right.
The paper of record is probably the worst on the issue of U.S. imperialism. They're the biggest cheerleaders for Guaido and the U.S. project on Venezuela. Although I think it's unusual that last February in 2019 that they did unveil and reveal through their investigation the fact that those tractor trailers that Maduro was accused of setting on fire was in fact done by the terrorists who were trying to invade on behalf of the U.S. That's interesting. But they're very, very, very bad. They really demonize the country.
I totally agree, and without ever giving the full context as to the U.S. intervention, as you mentioned, with trade and stuff, it's kind of ironic that Venezuela is often pointed to as an example of what will happen to a country if we allow socialism to occur. But in reality, as you've said, a lot of the reason it is in the state it is because of U.S. intervention. We're not allowing them to have the country they want via the trade and all that other stuff.
Yeah, and people aren't starving. I run into so many people in the streets because I've been on media, so they know who I am, and who I've said, talk to me, let me know about yourself, and they go, "We're not starving." The government actually provides monthly shipments of food to 6 million families, and their plan was to double that to every 15 days, but then the sanctions really deepened and tightened. It's amazing that the gold and the money in at least 14 foreign banks is being held back because of U.S. pressure. And the Bank of England, the Bank of Portugal, they're holding onto the gold. They won't release it. And that's why the solidarity from Russia and China is so critical, as well as Iran. I mean, the oil refineries of the country have been debilitated greatly because you have to constantly update the parts. You have to update the oil industry very much because it's heavy chemical use and it degrades fast. And without the parts, Iran sent ship after ship of not only oil and gasoline, but the parts so that they could repair the system. Under threat of the U.S., of course, but the international solidarity is more important than ever to oppose U.S. imperialist designs on the world. It's not just Latin America. It's China. It's against Russia. It's against North Korea. Any country that's independent of the U.S.
Gloria, I don't want to pivot too far, but just to return to our conversation to domestic politics and policing and mass incarceration, you've spoken at length about a friend of yours, Leonard Peltier. For people who aren't familiar with his work and his political imprisonment, I wondered if you could just speak on his behalf and explain why he's been held behind bars for nearly half a century.
Yes, in our work these past weeks and months, actually, a lot of our people around the country to get us on the ballot, collecting tens of thousands of signatures. We're going to be on in at least 11 states. And everyone gets asked when they talk about, we mentioned Leonard Pal, they go, who is he? And I say in a little short thing, I say, you know what the U.S. did to the Black Panthers, how the FBI carried out the COINTELPRO program, repressed them, basically crushed the Black Panthers. It's what they did and attempted to do to the American Indian movement, which was really inspired by the Black Panthers and the civil rights movement of the United States when it was founded in 1968 by Dennis Banks and Clyde Belcourt. Leonard Peltier became a member of that group at a time that the demand for sovereignty and respect for the treaties that the U.S. had signed with the Native nations in the 1800s were completely abrogated, violated. And then in the reservation of Pine Ridge in South Dakota, Pine Ridge is in the poorest county of the United States, has been and still is. High unemployment of 90%. And the average wages there on that reservation are between $2,600 and $3,500 a year, the poorest county. In the 1970s, in the midst of the rising of civil rights and liberation movements of Black, Latino, Native groups, the administration of Pine Ridge Reservation was led by a man named Dick Wilson. He was extremely corrupt, stealing the money that was supposed to go to the people of the reservation. And there began to be this movement of traditional people, the people who believe in the old cultures versus the attempt of the US to wipe out Native culture and independence. And he carried out a war. Dick Wilson had police called the Goon Squad, the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, they were called. That was their initials. And they literally killed, from the time of the Wounded Knee takeover, that was what American Indian movement led with the Native population there. They had an occupation of sacred land that's theirs, that's the Native people's land. And for 71 days, the US Army and the National Guard fired literally 300,000 bullets against this peaceful occupation. It was like a war, 71 days. But when it was over, some people were indicted, but it was basically like a truce. And yet from that time of 1973 to 1975 on that reservation, 64 people, almost all traditionals, supportive of the American Indian movement, supportive of the right to their land, were murdered. People had their homes shot into. And so with this terror, the FBI, the police, the BIA refused to act and investigate any of those killings. So the people asked for the American Indian movement to come in and defend them. Leonard Pal and a good number of other men and women came, along with the people of the reservation, and they were setting up camp to protect the people from the violence. June 26, 1975, 45 years ago, last month, the encampment was there, and on an area called the Jumping Bull Ranch, the FBI, 2 FBI agents in unmarked cars, unannounced, roared into the land and supposedly to serve a warrant on a Native man, accusing him of the theft of a pair of boots. Now, how does the FBI get involved to serve a search warrant for a pair of boots? But that's what their pretext was. What happened was a shootout, because they didn't know, are these going to be more people to come to kill us? And there was self-defense. Well, to make a long story short, 3 of them were indicted for murder because 2 of the FBI agents were killed. And a Native man was killed as well in the shootout. But there was never an investigation on his death. The FBI didn't care about that. But they were going to find their, who they were going to accuse. 2 of the men who were put on trial on the same charges, Leonard was one of the 3, but 2 of them were put on trial, moved out of venue into an all-white jury in the conservative state of Iowa in the 1970s, and because they were allowed by the judge to present the background of the violence, what the struggle was about, and that it was a self-defense issue. They were exonerated by the all-white jury. So the FBI was infuriated that there was nobody found guilty of the killing of the agents. So they decided, Leonard Pal hasn't been tried yet. Well, he had escaped to Canada. And so they began a complete operation to convict him, to railroad him in a kangaroo court. They falsified evidence. They found a woman, a Native woman who had mental issues, very severe, very poor, and they forced her to say that she was Leonard's girlfriend and that she saw him kill the agents. Completely false. She later said that they threatened to murder her, to grind her up in a meat grinder where they would never find her, take her child away. She was forced to say that, but she recanted later. But they used that to extradite him under false excuse from Canada. And that's why he's in prison ever since. He was tried in North Dakota, and that judge refused to allow any background, refused to allow the defense, the self-defense grounds.
Basically refused to let him make his case.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's more to that, but it's a long story, and it's 45 years coming up next June that he's behind bars. And yet I got to visit him in February. He's a remarkable man, as are many of the political prisoners, those who are in prison for their political ideas, those who are trying to change this unjust economic and social structure. And but he has to get out. There's a worldwide campaign for him, and we're part of calling for his freedom.
Yeah, well, we thank you so much for the work you're doing and drawing attention to that case, and that's obviously a horrible tragedy and injustice.
And I want to recommend, if you want to know more about it and to see him and hear him, you can watch the movie Incident at Oglala. Oglala is Oglala. It was produced and narrated by Robert Redford, and it was made a good number of years ago, but it's still very relevant. And you can read his book, the biography of his life and about the trial, called In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, by Peter Matheson, and then his own writings. Leonard has his own book as well.
Okay, I'll check that out. Thank
Yeah,
you.
we could definitely put a link to Leonard's book in the description as well, so people can find it.
Absolutely. Well, Gloria, you've spoken of some of these injustices that are occurring on, in our country, and I just wanted to ask you, as the PSL candidate, what really is the message of the Party of Socialist Liberation, and why do you think that it's so important that people don't continue voting for the Democrats and Republicans to try to get us out of this mess?
There are probably half the population that is entitled to vote, even registered to vote, that long ago gave up the idea that the elections have anything to do with their life. And you could basically say that's true, because the transition from Democrat to Republican to Democrat remains the same, that the rich get richer, the ruling class gets more powerful, the police get more repressive. Everything that we see is because with capitalism, the monopolization grows, it intensifies, and that results in more poverty for the working class and even the middle class today. I think that the pandemic shows the absolute bankruptcy of the system. Everybody can see it, and the world can see it too, where other countries have completely flattened the curve or reduced the damage by a major government intervention of the PPE, of the isolation that is encouraged on a national plan. You have in this country not only a president, extremely reactionary, who barely could put on a mask one time publicly, and yet has said that it's fake, that it's false, that it's against him. We all know this horror, that tens of thousands of people, I would say more than 100,000 lives could have been saved.
Yeah.
And this is absolute criminal. It's criminal also on the part of all the other Republicans who've been backing Trump all the way. And the Democrats who, for the last 3 years, have been trying to get him impeached on the basis of a Russiagate, another false charge that's really meant to demonize a country that the U.S., Pentagon, and the ruling class in general, when I mean ruling class, I mean the political structure of this system that has the intention of, because capitalism must always grow or die. If the capitalists don't grow, they have the risk of dying. The U.S. imperialist system is seeking domination all over the world, and to do that, you have to have both of the parties that switch from one to the other be in agreement. This is our system, and we will defend it. That's why, as you said before, that the issue of Venezuela, it's a common cause for the Democrats and Republicans. And so with the pandemic, you've had the total failure of the Democrats to fight for the people.
Yeah, we just saw I believe the House failing to pass a Medicare for all bill, even though it wouldn't have passed the Senate anyway. It was largely a symbolic, effort on the part of the left in the House, but it still passed pretty overwhelmingly. The Democrats decided that even in these times of a pandemic, when, people are about to be out on the streets and evicted and everything, that nope, now is apparently not the time for a single-payer healthcare system. It's pretty outrageous. Does the PSL embrace a universal healthcare system, I'm going to guess?
Yeah, we were saying that Bernie Sanders call for Medicare for all was a very good start. It started to break open this idea that people should have a national health care plan. But we believe that health care could be and should be completely provided for free. No amount of money, even if it's a small amount, should be an obstacle to people's need for care. Because you can still lower it to what would be a reasonable cost, an affordable cost for millions of people. But in this country, there are millions who don't have a penny, who are barely eking out survival. And psychologically as well, there should be no barrier to their feeling they can walk into a doctor's office or a hospital. And I think that's what's so sad about this pandemic, is that for the early months, the first 3 months at least, because it was so intense and it went through the country like wildfire, especially in the nursing homes, that people were told, don't come in until you can't breathe. By that time, it was too late for most people. By the time that you were critical and had to go under a ventilator, of which there were not enough, 80% of the people die when they get on the ventilator because it's too late, because their oxygen level, the deterioration of their organs, all of that. And they could have had earlier care. And in addition, the craziness, this quack science of Trump to call for the hydroxyquil,
Chloroquine, yeah.
Then now you see this dictator Bolsonaro pushing and pushing and pushing. Because I think he wants to show, I'm your loyal buddy, Trump. Yeah. Help me out here. And he's already reviled in his own country because it's number 2 in the world of incidents.
Yeah, it seems like America is almost heading towards a kind of Brazil-like situation with the way our wealth is really concentrating at the top, and our leaders are getting increasingly authoritarian. Can you speak a little bit to the conditions in Brazil right now, if you're familiar?
I think it's worse in Brazil. It's true though that in Brazil, the number of police killings is at least 50% more than in the United States. But why use the United States as a standard for the level? The United States is by far the greatest killer of people by the police. The police shouldn't even be armed.
Yeah.
Why are police who patrol for supposed safety, why are they armed? They turn the guns against the people. In the U.S., it's an average of 1,000 to 1,300 every year of police killings. Mostly Black and Latino. Native killings are actually quite high in proportion to the population. But all of them are really unjustified. And the problem is that they don't really solve crime. They're part of the criminal problem.
Yep.
To solve crime, you have to get to the economic roots. If there's no formal employment or formal means to survive, there will be informal means. And people who are in the street selling drugs, they don't bring them in. Yeah. They don't have the means to go out to Colombia and fly in plane loads of cocaine or to produce all the drugs killing the streets. Before the pandemic, I think one of the greatest crises in our country is that of drug addiction, of the crack, of the meth, of the opioids. It's horrific. And you can lay the blame on pharmaceuticals like that Purdue, I forget the name. It's owned by the Sackler family. The Sackler family, which has become a billionaire entity, strictly by their invention of the OxyContin. Mm-hmm. And now they're putting all their money into tax shelters, hiding it away so that they don't owe to the victims. Over 400,000 people who've died by opioids and the byproduct of opioids, which is people moving on to heroin and other street accessible drugs.
Yeah.
They're criminal. And when Trump said, Trump said, execute the drug traffickers. Why don't you start with the Sackler family?
Yeah.
And really quick. But we actually are against the death penalty.
Oh, yeah.
Because those who get executed are the poor and the working class.
Yeah, and often the completely innocent.
Yeah. The man right now in California who was facing execution, Kevin Cooper, but you could name hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
And the death penalty has to be abolished in this country.
Yeah. Couldn't
But
agree.
the question of police brutality, there's a lot of slogans and demands now in the movement. And there's one about the abolition of the police and the prisons. We're all for that. The prison system is an abomination in the US. And the police are occupation forces, and they're part of the state apparatus to keep the rich in power, to keep the system in place. But what we really need, in addition to fighting for the reforms, we salute the people who are saying, stop the no-knock invasion
Mm-hmm.
that killed Breonna Taylor. Stop the chokehold. Well, there's already a ban on chokehold, but look what they did to George Floyd.
Same with the body cameras.
Literally a chokehold. That was total lynching.
Yeah, and the body cameras. I mean, they're just going to turn them off or pretend that they weren't working. It's a complete farce that these little regulations are going to fix anything. And I feel like that's a pretty good metaphor for where we are as the country. People hoping that the Democrats adding on body cameras and no-knock warrants to the situation is going to fix everything. And when in reality, it's just going to, put a little bit of tape on the problem, and it's only going to continue to get worse in a institutional level. Now, Gloria, you've run for president multiple times, and I just wanted to ask you as a final question: what do you get treated like by the media in this country? It seems like this is such a rigidly two-party system country, and our media just adheres to it blindly without ever questioning it, barely ever covering third-party candidates or asking that they be on the debate stage. It seems crazy that people continually are blind to the fact that they do have more choices than just the Republicans and Democrats. And yeah, I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yes, it's a whole culture to back up again the electoral system.
Yeah.
To keep the system in place. It's a total censorship. As a presidential candidate in the past, I have never been on a national TV interview or anything. The only time I appeared on national TV was 2016 when I was arrested in Baton Rouge as soon as I arrived for the protest against the killing of Alton Sterling. The day that I arrived in, I think January 11, I was arrested along with 130 youth who were there protesting peacefully.
Yeah.
And as I was in handcuffs and being taken by the police to the jail, there was a TV camera, and I shouted, "My name is Gloria La Riva, and I'm from San Francisco." I didn't say I was a candidate because it was just so quick.
Yeah.
And I appeared on CNN. That was it. But they locked people out because look what they did to Bernie Sanders. The media kept hiding the fact that he was winning primaries and was really rising in the poll and was raising more money than the other candidates of the 30 some odd, 20 some odd Democrats.
Yeah.
And they are part of the whole power structure. They didn't want Bernie Sanders to win, and neither did the Democrats. The Democrats were his biggest enemy. They'd rather Trump had won than Bernie Sanders have a chance to disrupt their game.
100%.
So what chance do we have? The chance that we have is a chance that the movement has. How many people have been murdered by the cops with nothing happening since Mike Brown? Just Mike Brown 6 years ago in August 2014. Over 6,000 people have murdered since then. 2 or 3 maybe have been convicted of police. And now you're seeing more charges of, more charges against the police who've been killing recently because of an uprising.
Yep.
So we're using our presidential campaign, our election campaign, to talk about the issues. How does change happen in the United States? By organizing, mobilizing, by the unions, by the workers, by the youth fighting police brutality, by the people fight for 15. I ask people, well, what politician started the Fight for 15 campaign? People go, God, I don't know. I said, nobody started. It was the workers. It was the low-wage workers who don't even have a union.
Yep.
McDonald's, Walmart. And the unions that helped them. That's how it became feasible to demand $15 an hour. when before it was $7.25. And
Mhm.
people thought if you asked for $10, that was asking a lot.
Yeah.
And now $15 was like, yeah, that's right. I could use $15 an hour. So now that we've had several months of $600 added to people's unemployment,
Mhm.
I know so many people, my own relatives and friends, who go, now I'm able to pay my bills. It's been great to have that extra $600 on top of my $200-300 I would have gotten, maybe, in unemployment. That's what people should have anyway. At least $600 extra added to the wages that they get now. I can't believe that in some states that still have the $7.25 or whatever change it is,
Yeah,
as
$7.25.
minimum wage.
Yep.
You can't live like that. You can't even live with 2 jobs. And then who takes care of your kids? What kind
Especially
of a
during
life do you have?
the times of a pandemic when, arguably all work is, should be hazard paid.
These are dangerous ideas. If Bernie Sanders, a 30-plus year senator from Vermont, can't even get the decent media coverage. I mean, he got media coverage, but it was always like, oh yeah, and he won the primary. Oh, but Biden's doing well. Biden, who didn't win anything until the election before Super Tuesday. But I think we always do very well in our election campaigns. And we've also run local people. We've run people for Congress. We did this year. We've run people for city council in Washington, D.C. But it is a locked out game.
Yeah.
And the message of socialism is more popular than ever.
Mhm.
When Trump said last year, there will never be socialism in the United States, and we will end it in Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, what he was saying was, we're worried because there is a movement growing. And people aren't becoming socialists in the United States, for the most part, because they're looking at Cuba and Venezuela. They're becoming socialists because they're looking at their own life in America, and that capitalism doesn't work. I know so many young people in our party, many who've just joined in the last 2 years. And when you ask them, how did you become a socialist? Well, I grew up poor. My parents were having a hard time. And I was thinking, capitalism? So I started looking on the internet. And I started reading Marx and Engels. It's amazing how many people are reading about socialism and joining the movement.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Gloria. We really appreciate speaking to you about the Party for Socialist Liberation platform and what you guys have been up to. So really appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Hi, Gloria. I'll just pop back in. My internet cut out in the middle of our interview. I apologize. I just wanted to say thank you so much for popping on.
Yeah, I'd like to say also that it would be great if people could contact us if they'd like to, if I could give our contact.
Oh, absolutely.
They can contact us primarily at liberationnews.org. So that's liberation and then news.org, no dot, and also pslweb.org. But the Liberation News has the very up-to-date news coverage about what's happening in the streets from Portland to New York to Kentucky. The struggle for justice continues. And I thank you so much for the interview and be glad to talk again.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back. We thank you so much for your time today. It was truly great to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.